Towards the end of what you've read, you've found the terms incorporeality and unity cropping up rather a lot. Now, the former idea of incorporeality is something that religious people often learn as little children, that God doesn't have a physical body. He's not made up of physical parts like everything else, but rather is entirely non-physical or incorporeal. This, for Maimonides, is an absolutely essential belief. Unlike some of the other things he teaches us in the guide, that he does not believe should necessarily be taught to just anyone, this idea has to be made clear to everyone, as he explains in chapter 35 of the first part of the guide, quoted here, and you'll have to excuse his politically incorrect views here. He was, after all, a creature of his time. But the quote here says, "The negation of the doctrine of the corporeality of God and the denial of his having a likeness to created things and of his being subject to affections are matters that ought to be made clear and explained to everyone according to his capacity, and ought to be inculcated in virtue of traditional authority upon children, women, stupid ones, and those of a defective natural disposition." As I say, apologies. Now, what he's saying there is that denying that God is physical is something everybody has to know. And that is to also deny that he has any likeness to created things, and that he is subject to affections. We'll return to that shortly. Why does this matter to him so much? Well, part of this might be directed against the Christian belief that God could be embodied in human form, but much more importantly for Maimonides, there are philosophical reasons that this matters, and they're mainly to do with this other idea of unity. You see, physical things are made up of parts, which means they can decompose into those parts and therefore be destroyed. But according to the philosophers of the day, non-physical things have no parts. They're a perfect unity, so they cannot therefore be destroyed or decompose, which is obviously important for an eternal God, and is the meaning of the daily statement in the Shema that God is one. The second quote on unity pretty much states this too, the idea that God cannot be divided. It also means that God is not dependent on anything, that God is not dependent on various different attributes that define him. And that's very important. God cannot be a dependent being. God is completely independent. Everything else depends on him. Now, so far, so pedestrian. None of this is unusual. All our thinkers believed that God was one and God can't be physical, though contrary to popular belief, it was not always the case that every Jew always believed this, as Maimonides notes in the very first chapter of the guide. But Maimonides goes much further than this by drawing out all of its implications, because for Maimonides this means that God is so entirely different from us, or indeed from anything that we can even conceive, that we cannot actually use our language to describe him at all. Our language has developed in relation to our world, and we use it to describe the things that we encounter, but it's therefore entirely unsuitable as a vehicle for describing God. The limits of language here are noted in the first quote under that heading. Now, clearly the Torah does describe God all the time, but for Maimonides this is just God conceding to our weakness. You see, we find it really difficult to understand the idea of something that exists with no physical presence. We think that if it has no physicality, then it can't exist. So the Torah, in Maimonides' view, has to speak in our language so that we don't mistakenly think that God, being non-physical, does not exist. See the quote here where he says, "The Torah speaketh in the language of the sons of man," taken from the Talmud. And he goes on, the meaning of this is that everything that men are capable of understanding and representing to themselves at first thought has been ascribed to him as necessarily belonging to God, may he be exalted. Hence, attributes indicating corporeality have been predicated of him in order to indicate that he may be exalted exists. inasmuch as the multitude cannot at first conceive of any existence save that of a body alone. That's the important point. Yeah, most people can't conceive of things existing unless they're bodies. We think if it's not a body, it doesn't exist. And that's why the Torah has to say all these things about God, even though they're not really true. Now, ideally, Maimonides actually says, as you can see here in the final quote under the limits of language, that we should be silent. We shouldn't speak about God at all. And obviously, most of us can't do that. We need to communicate with God through prayer. Many of us need to think of him as actually relating to us in a personal way. Now, on the one hand, Maimonides certainly maintains the obligation to pray, though he does think that we need to radically reinterpret what the words mean. The first part of the guide is taken up with his theory of divine attributes and how we should understand them, but we can't really go into details of that here. Suffice to say that Maimonides believes ascribing any property to God divides him into different parts and is therefore forbidden, as it denies his unity. The main point for Maimonides is that God has to be more than just Superman. It's not just that we are powerful and God is super powerful or omnipotent, as the technical term goes, or that we have knowledge, but God has super knowledge, or is omniscient, as philosophers like to say. Rather, God is so radically different or transcendent that we cannot really think of him this way at all. And that has some very radical implications. It means that often Maimonides denies that God relates to us in a personal way or indeed at all. Look at the following two quotes, the first two under implications and significance. The first one denies any relation between God and us. The second one says that God never speaks. God can't speak. Speech is a physical thing. And God has not got the physical organs to speak. Now, in that case, what on earth happened at Mount Sinai, according to Maimonides? Obviously, all of these things become very problematic. And most of our thinkers, while happy to say that God is incorporeal and a unity, would be very unhappy to draw all these radical conclusions from those facts. So Halevi, for example, seems to say that regardless of what you think your philosophical arguments prove, Maimonides, since we experienced God saving us and speaking to us, we are philosophically justified in ignoring those arguments. Experience trumps reason for Halevi. Maimonides, on the other hand, would say that the very texts that Halevi is using here to show that God saved us and spoke to us can't be taken literally. They need to be reinterpreted in line with the philosophical truths that he believes he has proven. And to deny this for Maimonides, as the final quote here tells us, is actually even worse than idolatry, though sometimes Maimonides is a little bit more lenient on that and says some people clearly need these types of beliefs. Now, what's interesting here is it seems like the spectre of Halevi's philosopher from a couple of weeks ago looms over us in much of what Maimonides writes, and it seems pretty clear that his God is very far removed from our ordinary conception of God and miles away from Halevi's. But Maimonides' view can have advantages too. Philosophically speaking, it can solve one of the big problems, the problem of evil. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why does God do that to us? Well, Maimonides' God isn't doing that to us because he doesn't relate to us in that way at all. And religiously, Maimonides sees this view of God as very mature. You're not worshipping God because of what you can get out of it, which really is worshipping yourself in a way. Instead, you're worshipping God because he is the highest value, because truth that he represents is the highest value. It's like being nice to your brother and sister, not so that you can get some candy or money, but because you understand it's just the right thing to do. So while this is clearly a very non-traditional view of God, it is one that Maimonides thinks is significant and can be reconciled with religion.